Destiny, please don't let them do this!
Those words were my husband's desperate plea as security escorted him from the hospital in handcuffs, and they would be the last time Omari Williams ever spoke to me as his wife. What he didn't know was that I was the one who'd locked him in that storage room, the one who'd called HR, and the one who'd just uncovered $15,000 in stolen narcotics that would send him to federal prison. 7 years into my marriage, I thought I had achieved the impossible. A partnership where love and ambition didn't just coexist, they thrived. My husband, Omari Williams, wasn't just my spouse. He was my colleague and confidant, the man who understood the brutal 36-hour shifts and the weight of a white coat better than anyone. We were Peachtree Memorial Hospital's power couple, the doctor and the nurse who proved that professional hierarchy meant nothing when two people were truly devoted. Every shift change, Omari would find me. It didn't matter if I was elbow-deep in charts or mid-consultation. He'd appear with a protein shake he had blended that morning, knowing I'd skip meals otherwise. Dr. Ash Williams needs her fuel, he'd say with that devastating smile, using my full professional name even in private moments. During night shifts, he'd text me room numbers where he'd stashed fresh scrubs, the ones he warmed in the dryer because he knew how cold the surgical wing got. When I would collapse after a 14-hour surgery, I'd wake to find my stethoscope cleaned, my tablet charged, and a post-it note on my locker. Cheers to my brilliant wife. My hero. These weren't just gestures. They were proof that I'd found someone who saw past the chubby girl who'd fought twice as hard to earn respect in medical school, past the woman who still flinched when she caught her reflection in the surgical suite mirrors. For Omari, I'd restructured my entire financial life. When we married, I was already making triple his salary as an attending physician, but I never wanted him to feel like the lesser partner. I covered the mortgage on our Buckhead townhouse. I paid for his continuing education certifications. I financed the luxury SUV he wanted because, as he said, a man needs to feel like a provider, Destiny. I told myself it was partnership, not charity. I convinced myself that carrying the financial weight was just another way of showing love, the same way he showed love by remembering how I took my coffee or rubbing my feet after double shifts. My mother warned me, "Baby, a man who lets you pay for everything while he plays hero at work is not a partner. He's a dependent." But I was determined to prove that our love transcended money, that I'd built something real with someone who valued me for more than my credentials or my bank account. At Peachtree Memorial, we'd created our own ecosystem. I made sure Omari got the best shift assignments, not through favoritism, but by quietly advocating for his expertise during staffing meetings. When his annual review came up, I prepared talking points for his supervisor, highlighting his patient rapport scores. I memorized the names of every nurse on his floor, so I could ask thoughtful questions when we carpooled home. I'd stock the break room fridge with his favorite energy drinks and the specific brand of granola bars he preferred. My colleagues would joke, "Dr. Ash Williams, you spoil that man." And I'd smile, feeling proud, feeling needed. After shifts, I'd wait for him in the parking garage, even when I'd finished hours earlier, because he'd told me once that coming home to an empty driveway made him feel alone. My entire routine orbited around making sure Omari felt supported, celebrated, essential. He'd wrap his arms around me and whisper, "What would I do without you, Destiny? You're my rock." I believed I was his foundation. I had no idea I was just convenient. Everything shifted 6 months ago when Peggy arrived on the cardiac observation unit, a long-term patient, 33 years old, recovering from a complicated heart procedure. She was one of those women who wore vulnerability like armor, always apologizing for needing help, always praising the staff with wide, grateful eyes. I first noticed her during morning rounds when she grabbed Omari's hand and said, "You have the gentlest touch." I barely felt that IV adjustment. She had this way of making direct eye contact, her voice dropping to something intimate and confessional. Most patients treated nurses professionally, but Peggy treated Omari like a savior. I dismissed it as typical patient attachment, She was scared, alone, and he was genuinely good at his job. When she started requesting him specifically for routine tasks, asking the charge nurse if Nurse Williams could handle her vitals instead of the assigned staff, I told myself it was harmless. I even felt a flicker of pride. My husband was so skilled, so compassionate, that patients felt safe with him. Peggy began to weave herself into our professional life with surgical precision. She'd ask Omari to stay after his rounds to just talk for a few minutes about her anxiety. She'd save her questions about discharge planning for when he was on duty, even if another nurse had already answered them. During my own rounds, she'd light up when she saw me. "Oh, Dr. Ash Williams, you're so lucky to work with your husband. He tells me you two are a team. That's so rare." It felt like admiration, not infiltration. She'd bring in homemade cookies for the nursing station. Just a small thank you to Nurse Williams and his amazing colleagues. Omari started mentioning her casually at home. "Peggy's doing better today. She's really working hard on her recovery." Then, Peggy asked if we could recommend a good physical therapist. Nothing alarming, nothing overt, just small threads of connection that I was too confident, too trusting, to recognize as a web. I was so secure in our partnership that I couldn't see the architecture of betrayal being built in plain sight. The changes started in very little ways. Omari began volunteering for the overnight shifts he'd always avoided, claiming he wanted to pick up extra hours for a vacation fund. His phone, which used to sit casually on the counter, was suddenly always face down, password protected with a code I didn't know. When I asked about it, he'd laugh. "Destiny, you're not going to turn into one of those paranoid doctor wives, are you? I'm just trying to keep patient info secure." He started lingering after shifts, saying he needed to finish charting or help orient a new nurse. Once, I saw a text preview flash on his locked screen. "Can't wait to see you tonight." When I asked who it was, he said it was his gym buddy confirming a workout. I felt ashamed for asking. Here I was, a successful physician, reduced to the insecure wife questioning her husband. I blamed my weight, my schedule, my inability to be the effortless woman he deserved. I told myself I was imagining things, that stress was making me paranoid. Meanwhile, Omari's deception was so flawless that I apologized to him for doubting his integrity. Then came the night that shattered everything. It was a Thursday 3 weeks ago. I'd finished a grueling emergency appendectomy and was heading to the physician lounge to grab my belongings when I realized I'd left a critical patient chart in the surgical supply storage room, a restricted area on the 3rd floor that staff rarely used after hours. The hallway was dark, silent except for the hum of industrial refrigeration units. As I approached the heavy steel door, I heard something that made my blood stop. Muffled voices. A low, familiar laugh I'd heard 1,000 times across pillows and dinner tables. Omari's laugh. And beneath it, a woman's breathy whisper I recognized instantly. "Peggy." I should have turned around. I should have knocked, announced myself, given them a chance to scramble into some plausible excuse. But my feet carried me closer to that door, my hand pressing against the cold steel as I leaned in to listen. My heart was hammering so loud, I thought they'd hear it through the reinforced walls. Omari's voice came through first, low and intimate in a tone I thought was reserved only for me. "You know we can't keep doing this here. Someone's going to notice." There was a rustling sound, fabric against fabric, and then Peggy's voice, breathy and pleading. "But this is the only place we can be alone. Your wife works such long shifts, and I'm stuck in that room all day. I need you, Omari. I need this." The way she said "your wife" made my stomach turn, like I was an obstacle to be navigated rather than a person who existed. Like I was the inconvenience in their grand romance. I heard him laugh again, that deep, satisfied sound he used to make when I'd surprise him with his favorite meal or cover an extra shift so he could sleep in. "Peggy, baby, you know you're worth the risk. Destiny's so buried in her charts and surgeries, she wouldn't notice if I disappeared for a week." The casual cruelty of it knocked the air from my lungs. I stood there in my surgical scrubs, still wearing the mask I'd pulled down around my neck, and felt every insecurity I'd ever buried come rushing back. The chubby girl who got picked last in gym class. The medical student who'd been told she didn't look like doctor material. The wife who'd convinced herself that paying for everything was partnership, not pathetic. Something in me shifted then. Not heartbreak, not tears. Something colder, sharper, more surgical. I reached into my white coat pocket and pulled out my master key ring, the one that gave me access to every restricted area in this hospital. My hands were steady as I found the supply room key, as I slid it silently into the heavy-duty lock mechanism from the outside. The bolt clicked into place with a satisfying thunk that they probably couldn't hear over whatever they were doing in there. I tested the handle once. Locked. Secure and trapped. Then I pulled out my phone, scrolled past Omari's contact, past the heart emoji I'd attached to his name like a fool, and found the direct line I needed. When the voice answered, professional and alert despite the late hour, I kept my tone clinical, detached, every bit the respected physician I'd earned the right to be. This is Dr. Destiny Ash Williams, attending physician, employee number 47729. I need to report an urgent code of conduct violation in progress. I have a staff member and a current patient engaged in prohibited contact in supply storage room 3C. I've secured the location, and I'm requesting immediate HR and security response. There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath on the other end, and then rapid-fire questions about my certainty and location. I answered each one with the same ice-cold precision I used when presenting surgical complications to a review board. As I waited in that dim hallway for security to arrive, I realized I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. I was calculating. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a violation of hospital policy, a breach of professional ethics, and I had just turned it into an institutional problem. Let HR handle the mess. Let the hospital attorneys parse the liability. I was done being the understanding wife who carried the weight while he played the hero. I'd locked that door, and in doing so, I'd unlocked something far more powerful, my own ruthless clarity. The Chief of Human Resources, Patricia Montgomery, arrived in less than 12 minutes with 2 security officers and the hospital's legal counsel. I'd positioned myself exactly 10 feet from the supply room door, arms crossed, posture perfect, every inch the senior attending physician who'd just discovered a catastrophic liability event. Patricia's face was pale, her usually immaculate bun slightly disheveled from what was clearly a rapid departure from her home. She approached me with the cautious respect people reserve for unexploded ordnance. Dr. Ash Williams, I need you to walk me through exactly what you observed and what actions you've taken. Her voice was steady, professional, but I caught the edge of panic underneath. She knew what this meant. A staff member and a patient. The kind of violation that triggered mandatory reporting, immediate investigations, potential lawsuits that could crater the hospital's reputation. I handed her a printed incident report I'd generated on my tablet while waiting, complete with timestamps, location codes, and the relevant sections of the employee conduct manual highlighted. Yes, I'd spent my waiting time drafting documentation. Some women fall apart. I build cases. The report went like this. At approximately 22:47 hours, I approached supply storage room 3C to retrieve a misplaced patient chart. I heard voices inside that I identified as belonging to Omari Williams, RN, employee number 8-3-6-5-1, and the patient currently assigned to cardiac observation room 4-12, admitted under the name Margaret Genovese, known as Peggy. The conversation I overheard included explicit acknowledgement of an ongoing prohibited relationship between staff and patient, with direct references to concealment from hospital personnel and continued contact despite awareness of policy violations. I kept my voice clinical and detached, as if I were presenting a case study rather than describing the implosion of my marriage. Patricia's eyes widened as she scanned the document, her legal training clearly kicking in as she recognized the catastrophic scope. Patient vulnerability, power imbalance, breach of fiduciary duty. The hospital's liability exposure was astronomical if Peggy decided to claim coercion, or if her insurance company caught wind of compromised care standards. "You locked the door?" she asked, and I could see her mentally calculating whether that created additional legal complications. I met her gaze with the same unflinching directness I used when delivering devastating diagnoses. I secured the scene to prevent destruction of evidence and ensure both parties remained available for immediate questioning. As the discovering party and a senior physician, I judged it necessary to contain the situation until proper authorities arrived. I documented my actions with time-stamped photos of the locked door and my key card access log. The security officers exchanged glances, clearly impressed by my thoroughness. One of them, a former police officer named Marcus, who'd helped me with a disruptive family member last year, looked almost sympathetic. Patricia nodded slowly, her lawyer brain clearly approving of my strategic approach, even as her HR brain calculated the nightmare ahead. "I need to inform you," I continued, pulling out my phone to show her additional evidence, "that I've also compiled text message records from my husband's phone, bills showing unusual communication patterns with an unknown number during the same time frame as patient Vance's admission. I haven't accessed the content, but the frequency and timing suggest a pattern worthy of investigation." It was a lie. I had no such records yet, but I knew how to make someone believe a fortress of evidence was already built when I'd only laid the foundation. Patricia straightened her shoulders, her professional mask sliding into place as she turned to the security officers. "Unlock the door. I want both individuals separated immediately and escorted to separate conference rooms. No communication between them. And someone get me the patient's attending physician and her care team. We need to assess whether her medical treatment has been compromised." She looked back at me, and for just a moment, I saw something that might have been respect or possibly fear. "Dr. Ash Williams, I'm going to need you to provide a full statement. And I have to ask, are you able to remain professional given your personal connection to one of the involved parties?" I smiled then, a cold, sharp expression that felt nothing like the warm, hopeful woman I'd been an hour ago. "Ms. Montgomery, I'm a surgeon. I cut into people I care about to save their lives. Remaining professional is what I do best." The security officer's key turned in the lock with a metallic scrape that seemed to echo down the empty hallway. I watched from my position near the nurse's station as Marcus pulled the heavy door open, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt. The scene that spilled out was exactly as pathetic as I'd imagined. Omari stumbled into the hallway first, his scrub top untucked and twisted, his face shifting from confusion to absolute horror when he saw me standing there flanked by hospital brass. Peggy emerged behind him, her hospital gown askew, her carefully maintained fragile patient persona cracking as she registered Patricia's grim expression and the legal counsel's tablet already recording notes. "Destiny, wait, this isn't what it looks like," Omari started, his hand reaching toward me in that placating gesture he'd used 1,000 times when he needed something. When he needed money for a certification course. When he needed me to cover for his scheduling conflicts. When he needed me to be smaller so he could feel bigger. I didn't move, didn't flinch. Just watched him with the same detached clinical observation I'd used to assess a specimen under a microscope. Patricia stepped between us before he could approach closer, her voice cutting through his desperate rambling with administrative precision. "Mr. Williams, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation into violations of Policy 7.3.2 regarding staff-patient boundaries and professional conduct. You're required to surrender your badge, your access cards, and any hospital property in your possession. You'll be escorted off the premises and will receive formal notification of investigation procedures within 24 hours. I watched the color drain from Omari's face as the full weight of institutional consequences crashed down on him. This wasn't a marital argument he could smooth over with flowers and apologies. This was his career, his license, his entire professional identity being systematically dismantled by the very system he'd thought was just background scenery to his life. He turned to me again, panic replacing the initial shock. "Destiny, please, you can't let them do this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. You know me. You know I'd never compromise patient care." The audacity of him asking me to rescue him, to use my position and credibility to cover for his betrayal, would have been laughable if it wasn't so perfectly on brand. How many times had I bailed him out, covered his mistakes, made excuses for his shortcomings? I'd spent 7 years being his safety net, and he'd expected that net to catch him even as he was actively cutting the ropes. Patricia's second security officer moved to escort Peggy back to her room, but not before the legal counsel informed her that her patient advocate and a hospital liaison would be meeting with her within the hour to discuss the situation and ensure her continued care wouldn't be compromised. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were protecting her, the woman who'd manipulated her way into my husband's scrubs, because that's what the hospital had to do to limit liability. She was a patient first, a homewrecker second. I filed that bitter observation away in the growing catalog of injustices I was documenting for myself, knowing that dwelling on it wouldn't serve my larger purpose. As security began walking Omari toward the staff exit, he called back to me one more time, his voice cracking with something that might have been genuine fear. "Destiny, we need to talk. Please, don't do this." I finally spoke then, my voice carrying down the hallway with the authority of someone who'd earned every syllable of respect in this building. "Mr. Williams, any communication regarding this matter should go through the appropriate institutional channels and legal representatives. I have nothing to discuss with you." The formal address, the institutional language, the complete erasure of our personal connection. It was the most devastating thing I could have said, and we both knew it. I didn't go home that night. I went to my office on the executive physician floor, locked the door, and opened my laptop with the methodical calm of someone preparing for major surgery. First, I logged into our joint banking account and documented every transaction from the past 6 months, downloading statements and flagging irregularities I'd been too trusting to question before. $300 to a jewelry store I'd never heard of. $500 to a hotel in Buckhead on a Tuesday afternoon when he'd told me he was at a nursing conference. Regular cash withdrawals and odd amounts, always just under the threshold that would trigger automatic fraud alerts. I'd been funding his affair with my physician's salary, paying for the hotel rooms and gifts he used to woo another woman while I worked double shifts. By 3 a.m., I'd transferred my personal income and premarital investment accounts to a new bank, one where Omari had never been an authorized user. I'd contacted my financial advisor, a sharp woman named Teresa who I'd gone to medical school with, and arranged an emergency meeting to discuss asset protection strategies. Georgia was an equitable distribution state, not community property, which meant I had some leverage if I moved quickly and documented everything properly. My inheritance from my grandmother, the signing bonus from when I'd joined Peachtree Memorial, the investment portfolio I'd built before we met, all of it was potentially separate property if I could prove I'd kept it appropriately segregated. The problem was I hadn't. I'd been too in love, too eager to prove I trusted him completely, too willing to merge everything in the name of partnership. By dawn, I drafted an email to my attorney, Sandra Wilkins, a divorce specialist who'd handled the separation of one of my attending colleagues 2 years ago. I laid out the situation with clinical precision: 7-year marriage, significant income disparity, potential adultery claims, and now a professional ethics violation that would likely result in my husband's termination and possible license suspension. Sandra's response came through before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, probably because the sheer legal drama of the situation had activated her litigation instincts. Emergency consult today, 10 a.m. Bring all financial records, employment contracts, and any documentation of separate property. We're filing fast and we're filing hard. But I wasn't done with my night's work. I still had my security clearance as a senior attending physician, which meant I had access to administrative logs that regular staff members couldn't see. I pulled up Omari's shift records for the past 6 months, cross-referencing them with supply room access logs, medication dispensing records, and patient assignment sheets. What I found made my clinical detachment waver for the first time since I'd locked that storage room door. Omari had been accessing the pharmaceutical supply system during off hours, requisitioning Schedule 2 medications using patient codes that didn't match his assigned floor. He'd been logging into restricted areas of the electronic medical record system, viewing files for patients he had no legitimate clinical reason to access. And he'd been doing it all on nights when Peggy was admitted, when I was in surgery or on call, when he thought no one was watching. This wasn't just an affair. This was systematic exploitation of hospital resources, potential theft of controlled substances, and possible HIPAA violations that could trigger federal investigations. I sat back in my leather chair, my office window showing the first pink streaks of sunrise over Atlanta's skyline, and felt something close to vindication settle in my chest. I'd thought I was just exposing a cheating husband. Instead, I'd uncovered what looked like the early stages of a pharmaceutical fraud scheme. I compiled every suspicious log entry, every unexplained medication requisition, every irregularity I could find into a second report, this one flagged for the hospital's compliance officer and risk management department. If Omari thought losing his job was the worst consequence of getting caught, he was about to learn exactly how much worse things could get when you betrayed someone who knew where all the institutional bodies were buried. What happened over the next 72 hours would make you question everything you think you know about the people sleeping next to you. If you're still with me at this point in my story, thank you. Because what I'm about to tell you is the part that transformed my personal nightmare into something far more sinister, something that made me realize I hadn't just married a cheater. I'd been living with a criminal. The hospital's compliance officer, a former federal investigator named Robert Foster, called me into a secure conference room on Monday morning. When I walked in and saw the DEA liaison sitting next to him, my stomach dropped. Robert's expression was grave as he gestured for me to sit, and I noticed he'd positioned a legal counsel representative in the corner. This wasn't a routine follow-up. This was the moment when everything I'd suspected crystallized into something prosecutable. Dr. Ash Williams, Robert began, his voice carefully neutral, the investigation you initiated has uncovered significant irregularities that go beyond staff misconduct. He slid a folder across the table, and I opened it to find pharmacy dispensing logs highlighted in yellow, patient charts with red flags, and surveillance timestamps that made my blood run cold. Here's what they found, and I want you to think about this for a moment. Imagine you've just discovered your spouse is cheating, and you think that's the worst betrayal possible. Now imagine finding out that the affair was actually the cover story for something that could send them to federal prison. Over a 6-month period, Omari had requisitioned over $15,000 worth of Schedule 2 narcotics: oxycodone, fentanyl patches, hydromorphone, and others. He'd been using real patient ID numbers from the cardiac unit, patients who were legitimately prescribed pain management protocols, but he'd been ordering quantities that exceeded their documented needs. The hospital's automated systems had flagged some discrepancies, but because Omari was a trusted senior nurse with years of spotless service, the flags had been reviewed and dismissed as data entry errors. He'd been hiding in plain sight, using his reputation, using my credibility by association, to commit systematic pharmaceutical theft. But here's where it gets darker. Stay with me now, because this is where Peggy's role becomes clear. The DEA liaison, a woman named Agent Florentina Torres, leaned forward and explained what their preliminary investigation had uncovered. Peggy Genovese wasn't actually a cardiac patient recovering from valve surgery. Her medical records were real, her insurance was legitimate, but her condition had never required the extended hospital stay she'd been admitted for. She'd checked herself in with vague cardiac symptoms that were impossible to definitively rule out, symptoms that justified weeks of observation and monitoring. What would you do if you discovered the vulnerable patient you'd felt sorry for was actually the mastermind orchestrating the entire operation? Peggy had a history. 3 previous hospitalizations at different facilities across Georgia and Tennessee, each time forming close relationships with male nursing staff, each facility later reporting unexplained pharmaceutical discrepancies after her discharge. Agent Torres showed me surveillance footage from the hallway cameras near the supply storage area. This is the part that made me physically ill. The footage showed Omari entering the room multiple times over the past month, always during late-night shifts when supervisory staff were minimal. But here's what the cameras caught that I hadn't known to look for. Each time he entered, he carried his standard nursing supply bag. Each time he exited, approximately 8 to 12 minutes later, that bag was visibly heavier, sagging against his hip in a way that suggested significant added weight. The compliance team had cross-referenced those timestamps with pharmacy dispensing logs. Every single visit corresponded with medication requisitions he'd made using patient codes, medications that were never actually administered to those patients because the orders were fraudulent. Peggy wasn't his lover in the traditional sense. She was his partner, his accomplice, and quite possibly his handler. The investigators believed she was connected to a larger pharmaceutical diversion ring that targeted hospital staff members who were vulnerable to manipulation. And how do you think they identified those vulnerable staff members? They looked for people with financial stress, people who were living beyond their means, people who might be receptive to an opportunity to make extra money. Omari, with his expensive tastes and his physician wife's income covering his lifestyle, had been the perfect mark. The affair, the flattery, the manufactured vulnerability that made him feel like a hero rescuing a damsel in distress. It was all calculated recruitment. Robert slid another document across the table, and this one made me grip the edge of my chair. They'd traced Omari's personal banking records with a warrant executed that morning. Over the past 4 months, he'd deposited nearly $40,000 in cash into a separate account I didn't know existed. Small deposits, always under $10,000 to avoid federal reporting requirements, but consistent and clearly connected to the theft timeline. How would you feel, knowing your husband wasn't just betraying you emotionally, but had built an entire secret financial life on the proceeds of federal crimes? Crimes committed in the hospital where you'd built your reputation, using the trust and access that came from being married to you? Agent Torres looked at me with something approaching sympathy. Dr. Ash Williams, you may have saved lives by reporting what you found. If this operation had continued, we're looking at enough diverted opioids to supply street distribution for months. Your husband and Ms. Genovese weren't just stealing pills. They were feeding an epidemic. And that's when I realized the full scope of what I'd uncovered. What do you think hurt more? The betrayal of our marriage vows, or the betrayal of every oath he'd taken as a healthcare provider? I'll tell you what kept me awake that night. It was knowing that while I was saving lives in surgery, my husband was in the same building destroying them for profit. The formal hearing took place in the hospital's executive boardroom 2 weeks later, and I walked in wearing my white coat like armor. My attorney, Sandra, sat to my right with 3 bankers' boxes of evidence we'd compiled. Across the table sat Omari with a court-appointed public defender, who looked like he'd already given up. The hospital's legal team occupied the head of the table, flanked by Patricia from HR, Robert from Compliance, and Agent Torres representing the federal investigation. Omari wouldn't look at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the table surface as Patricia opened the proceedings, her voice crisp and formal as she read the charges. Violation of staff-patient boundary policies. Theft of controlled substances. Fraudulent use of hospital systems. Conspiracy to commit pharmaceutical diversion. Each charge landed like a gavel strike. When it was my turn to present evidence, I stood and walked them through everything with the same clinical precision I used for surgical case presentations. I showed them the access logs, the medication discrepancies, the surveillance footage. I presented the financial records Sandra had subpoenaed showing Omari's secret cash deposits. And then I showed them something that made even the seasoned legal team wince. Text messages recovered from Omari's phone by the DEA, showing explicit coordination with Peggy about which medications to target, which patient codes to use, and how to time the thefts to avoid detection. Messages where Peggy called him baby and my smart nurse, and coached him on exactly how to manipulate the pharmacy system. Messages where he complained about me, his clueless wife, who was too busy playing hero surgeon to notice what was happening under her nose. Omari's attorney tried to argue diminished capacity, claimed Peggy had manipulated a vulnerable man, suggested that Omari was a victim of a sophisticated criminal operation. But the evidence was overwhelming. The cash deposits proved intent. The systematic nature of the thefts proved premeditation. And the sheer volume of narcotics diverted proved this wasn't a one-time mistake, but a sustained criminal enterprise. Patricia didn't even need to deliberate. She looked at Omari with the kind of cold disappointment reserved for profound professional betrayals and delivered the verdict. Mr. Williams, your employment with Peachtree Memorial Hospital is terminated immediately for cause. Your nursing license suspension has been referred to the Georgia Board of Nursing, and this matter is being turned over to federal prosecutors for criminal charges. Security will escort you from the building, and you are permanently banned from all hospital properties. I watched him finally look up at me then, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate, and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." But I didn't feel anything. No vindication, no satisfaction whatsoever. Just a hollow sense of completion. Agent Torres informed the room that Peggy Genovese had been arrested that morning at a motel in Marietta, where she'd fled after being discharged from the hospital. She was facing federal conspiracy charges and was already cooperating with investigators, providing information about the larger pharmaceutical diversion network. Apparently, Omari had been her fourth successful recruitment. She had a talent for identifying men with ego problems and financial stress, men who could be seduced into betraying everything for cash and the illusion of being needed. The hearing concluded with Patricia addressing me directly, her professional mask slipping just enough to show genuine remorse. Dr. Ash Williams, on behalf of Peachtree Memorial, I want to express our deepest apology that these violations occurred within our institution and involved someone connected to your personal life. Your decisive action and professional integrity prevented what could have been a catastrophic public health crisis. The board has asked me to convey their gratitude and to assure you that additional safeguards are being implemented to prevent future occurrences. It was the kind of institutional apology that meant nothing and everything. They were covering liability, but they were also acknowledging that I'd done everything right while my world collapsed. 3 months later, I stood in that same executive boardroom for a very different meeting. The hospital board presented me with a formal commendation for my role in uncovering the pharmaceutical diversion scheme. They offered me a position on the newly formed Ethics and Compliance Committee, a role that came with additional compensation and institutional influence. I accepted, not because I needed the validation, but because I'd learned something crucial about power. Real power isn't carrying someone else's weight. Real power is knowing when to let them fall and watching the system catch them with consequences instead of excuses. My divorce was finalized 6 weeks after the hearing. Omari signed everything Sandra put in front of him, desperate to avoid any additional scrutiny that might worsen his federal charges. I kept the house, my investment accounts, and my premarital assets. He walked away with nothing but a public defender and a court date. The federal prosecutor told me his plea deal would likely result in 3 to 5 years in federal prison. Peggy got 7 years after refusing to fully cooperate. I felt nothing when I heard the sentences. They were just data points, outcomes of decisions made long before I'd locked that storage room door. But here's what actually mattered. One morning about 4 months after everything imploded, I walked past the surgical suite locker room and caught my reflection in the full-length mirror. I was in my scrubs, my white coat draped over my arm, my stethoscope around my neck. And for the first time in years, I didn't immediately catalog my flaws. I didn't see the chubby girl who'd needed validation or the insecure wife who'd paid for love with her salary. I saw Dr. Destiny Ash Williams, attending physician, committee member, the woman who'd saved her own life by refusing to be complicit in her own destruction. I'd spent 7 years trying to be enough for someone who was using me as a cover story for his crimes. I'd sacrificed my confidence, my financial security, and my peace of mind trying to prop up a man who saw my success as a resource to exploit rather than a partnership to honor. And when the truth revealed itself, I didn't fall apart. I didn't beg him to stay. I documented, I reported, and I let the system do what I'd been too emotionally invested to do myself. I held him accountable. My mother called me last week and said something that made me laugh for the first time in months. "Baby, you know what your problem was? You were so busy being a good wife that you forgot you were a great doctor. Now look at you. You saved yourself with the same precision you used to save everyone else." She was right. I'd performed the most important surgery of my life, and the patient was me. So here's what I want you to take from my story. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, believe them. When your gut tells you something is wrong, investigate with the same rigor you'd apply to anything else important in your life. And when you discover betrayal, don't just grieve it. Document it, report it, and let the consequences fall where they belong. I didn't just survive Omari's betrayal. I dismantled it systematically and rebuilt my life without the dead weight I'd been carrying for years. Now, if you believe that manipulators and liars like Omari and Peggy deserve to face consequences for exploiting the people who trust them, hit that subscribe button. Only people who think it's okay to use kindness as a weapon and compassion as a cover story for crimes would let this story disappear without taking action. Don't be like Omari, hiding behind someone else's success while destroying lives. Subscribe if you stand against manipulators who exploit trust for profit. And if you believe that professional betrayal is just as devastating as personal betrayal, comment, "I stand for accountability." Because people like Omari count on us staying silent, staying compliant, staying too polite to call out their crimes. Don't give them that power. Make your voice heard. Subscribe, comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear that they deserve better than being someone else's convenient cover story. I'm Dr. Destiny Ash Williams, and I saved my own life. Now go save yours.